here today. I'm very pleased to be here today to announce the government's plans for fairer access to a more sustainable pension that will be announced in next week's budget. More than 170,000 pensioners with modest assets will have their pensions increased from January 2017 by an average of around $30 per fortnight. This will include around 50,000 new full pensioners who are currently on a part pension. More than 90%, or 3.7 million pensioners and other Australians who have pension-linked benefits will either be better off or will have no change to their pension arrangements as a result of this being the sole area of change to pensions that is being proposed by this government. At the same time, the government will be taking off the table the measures that were put to last year's budget in relation to the indexation of pensions. That means that there will be no longer any plans to change the indexation of pensions from the current formula as was proposed last year. We always said if something was to come off the table, something has to come on the table, and the measures that I'm announcing today is what is coming on the table. The changes that were in last year's budget would have impacted the future indexation of more than 4 million pensioners around Australia and those receiving pension-linked payments, and those changes will now not proceed. A statement is also being released by the Minister for Veterans Affairs, Minister Ronaldson, today, noting that the withdrawal of last year's measure also means the effect of the reversals to indexation will apply to service pensions, veterans' disability pensions, including the special rate, or what is known as the TPI, the War Widows pension, wholly dependent partner payments and special rate disability pensions. And they will continue now to be, as is the case, the greater of the CPI, male total average weekly earnings movements, or of course the hybrid measure on the CPI. The savings achieved by this new plan for fairer access to a more sustainable pension will be $2.4 billion over the budget and the forward estimates. Under the proposed changes, the assets free area, as it is known, will be increased to support pensioners with low and modest assets. In order to qualify for a full pension from January 2017, the assets free area will increase from 202,000, where it is today, to 250,000 for single homeowners, and from 286,500 to 375,000 for couple homeowners. The family home will not be included in the assets test and never will under a coalition government. At the same time, the government will reduce the maximum value of assets you can hold to qualify for a part pension. For couples who own their own home, the maximum threshold is currently up to $1.15 million and $775,000 for single homeowners, not including the value of the home. Once again, the family home is not included in that assets test. This will be reduced through $823,000 and $547,000 for couples and singles respectively. For pensioners who do not own their own home, their thresholds at both the lower end and the higher end will be set at $200,000 above those for pensioners who own their own home. Now, this increases the gap between home-owning pensioners and non-home-owning pensioners on these thresholds by just over a third, or around 36%. That is intended to recognise the higher living costs associated with pensioners who don't own their own home. This way forward, under the Fairer Access to a More Sustainable Pension proposal, effectively restores what was known as the $3 taper rates, which were changed in 2007 by the Howard government. I note that at that time the budget was in surplus and there was $40 billion in the bank. Thanks to the Labor Party's 6 years, that is no longer the case, and those levels of taper rate changes from 2007, when it was reduced from $3 to $1.50, are no longer affordable. Over 14 years, for every $1,000 in assets above the minimum threshold for the full pension, fortnightly payments were reduced by some $3. This was changed to $1.50 in 2007. Now this put, at the time it was indicated, 110,000 extra people on the part pension and increased the cost to taxpayers by almost $1 billion a year. As we said, that's when the budget was in surplus and there was money in the bank. It is estimated that as a result of the changes that I'm announcing today, approximately 91,000 current part pensioners will no longer qualify for the part pension from January 2017, and a further 235,000 will have their part pension reduced. All people, I stress all those affected by the scaling back of the maximum asset threshold under this proposal will be guaranteed eligibility to the Commonwealth Seniors Health Card. That card provides the same concessional access to pharmaceuticals and other medical benefits and concessions as is provided to those who are on the pension. Those impacted by these changes will be able to maintain, it is estimated, their current level of income after their part pension is reduced or taken away by drawing down less than 1.84% on their additional assets. That's for single homeowners, that's the worst case scenario, and in the worst case scenario for couples, that's 1.76%. So those affected by these changes have assets, and by drawing down on those assets to those modest amounts, they will be in a position to maintain their incomes at the levels they are currently at. The government is seeking to ensure fairer access to a more sustainable pension. These are the only changes the government is putting forward for the pension. By reducing eligibility to the pension for those with more assets, they will become fully self-funded retirees. This means, though, we must retain the incentives through the tax system for superannuation. The government does not support Labor's proposal to tax superannuants more on the income they have generated for their retirement. Receiving a government welfare payment is not the same as being able to keep your own money. That is what we believe in the Coalition. We will tighten up welfare eligibility by removing perceived entitlements that do not have a strong link to need in the welfare system. But we will also retain incentive through the tax system for people who provide for themselves. Now, on another announcement today, we're announcing an income deduction cap on defined benefit schemes. The government will be closing a loophole opened up in 2007 through an unintended consequence of some legislative changes at the time that is currently allowing around 48,000 superannuants on higher incomes from some public sector and large corporate defined benefit superannuation schemes to effectively fly under the radar on the income test for the pension. When determining eligibility for a pension, it is important that income is properly assessed to ensure fairness in the system. For most people with a defined benefit income stream, the gross income they receive from those schemes is subject to the income test for the pension. However, for some, particularly for those who are part of some large state government public sector schemes, significant portions of their income are disregarded in assessing their eligibility for a pension under the income test. The reason for that is to reflect what is seen as the voluntary after-tax contributions made when they are working, but the amounts being deducted in these cases are in excess of those notional contributions. For example, a couple with a defined benefit scheme income of, say, $120,000 a year is currently able to reduce what is assessed by the pension income test by around 50%. Treating this portion of their income as a drawdown. Now, the remaining $60,000 is then assessed as income under the income test for the pension, which results in them receiving a pension in part of some $7,500 per year on top of the $120,000 they were drawing down from the scheme. We will be closing this loophole by applying a 10% cap on the amount that can be deducted for these purposes, as we believe this represents a fairer assessment of these type of arrangements. Around 2/3 of those who are involved in these schemes are already within that 10% cap, and they will be unaffected. The measure will also not apply to any military or veterans pensions. The change will also not affect the means test treatment of income streams purchased from retail providers of these products, such as AMP and AXA and funds of that nature, self-managed superannuation funds and small APRA funds, as they don't operate in this way. Closing this loophole will save taxpayers around $470 million in the budget and forward estimates. Happy to take questions.
Minister, from what you were saying just now, is the government now excluding any changes to the tax treatment or tax incentives for superannuation during the term of this government?
Well, that was actually the commitment we took to the last election, and that's what we've honoured in full. And we've also honoured in full our commitments on the pension as well. We said there would be no changes in this term, and what I've said today very clearly is that the government believes that we must maintain the incentives that exist for superannuation. Welfare is for need. Superannuation requires incentive, and that is what the government intends to continue.
Can you also give us some idea as to whether or not, between the two alternatives of changing the indexation system for pensions, which you've now abandoned, and this new package, what's the effect on the bottom line? Is this going to save money for the budget, or is it going to lose money or cost money to the budget?
No, as I said, these measures save $2.4 billion over the budget and forward estimates. So, particularly over the budget and forward estimates, this is an improved position. Over the longer term, the other measure had a larger, longer term impact. But what I'm announcing today is the product of many months of consultation, both with the stakeholders in the sector, and I particularly want to thank National Seniors and COTA and ACOS and other organisations with whom I've been in discussions with for some time, as well as crossbench senators such as Nick Xenophon and Senator Leonholm and Bob Day and Glenn Lazarus and others who have been working and understanding these proposals now for some time, and of course with my own colleagues on the government benches. I would hope that those in the Parliament will see this as those I've been speaking to see it, and that is a common sense, a constructive consensus proposal that really does strive for fairer access for a more sustainable pension. We have to maintain the goal of a sustainable pension. We have to maintain the goal of the march towards surplus, and this government, through this proposal, is doing both of those things. We might just go to someone else. Sure.
The Greens have come out today and flagged possible support for the measures you've announced, but they do want a broader review into retirement income superannuation. Are you happy to grant them that?
Well, look, that's a matter for the Prime Minister and the Treasurer. There's been active discussions around those types of proposals for some time. Of course, we have quite a number of reviews that are on foot at the moment, particularly the tax white paper, but there are other reviews, and I think many of the issues that have been raised in the context of the discussions we've had around this issue will fit neatly into things like the tax white paper discussion. But that said, we remain in open dialogue with stakeholders on this issue. I don't think necessarily these matters should be linked because this is a proposal which I think stands on its own 2 feet, both in terms of fairness, in terms of consensus, but also, I'd add to those things, in terms of ensuring a more sustainable pension for the future. Now, back in 2007, when the $3 taper rate was changed to $1.50, the Greens voted against that change. So, in reversing that decision, I would expect that they would welcome that. And I notice their comments today. I have had no discussions with the Greens about these matters. I know what their position on the record is, and I would simply trust that they would act consistent with their record.
A review is the price to pay to get these measures through the Senate, surely.
Well, look, measures will be presented to the Senate and we'll take it at that point. But I think these measures stand on their own 2 feet, and I think they are worthy of support in their own right, and that is not to rule out any other discussions that can be had on other topics, but that's really for the Prime Minister and Treasurer to discuss.
What's your advice to the 91,000 who won't get the pension?
My first word to the 91,000 is to thank them for providing for their own retirement, which will now see them be fully self-funded retirees. And they are in a position, in the worst case scenario, to draw down on the assets that they have, for couples over $820,000 of around about 1.7%, to maintain the income that they have had until now. And we do know that on the pension, that both in the first 5 years of the pension and in the last 5 years of the pension, the majority of pensioners are either increasing their assets or got their assets at the same level. The whole point of providing taxpayer-funded incentives through the tax system for superannuation is that people draw down on that in their retirement. It's not intended to be a taxpayer underwritten bequest program. It's intended to be a superannuation scheme to ensure a good and very livable standard in your retirement.
Are you confident of securing support in the Senate for these plans?
I believe these measures do deserve support, and I'm encouraged by the discussions I've had with those who will be reviewing these matters in the Senate.
Just to clarify the savings, you're saying that the savings achieved by this change will deliver $2.4 billion to the budget. But what I'm not quite clear on is that how does that compare to what would have been delivered to the budget under the planned changes to the indexation system?
Well, in last year's budget, and there's been a few changes in the parameters since last year's budget, but in last year's budget, from memory, it was around about $270 million or thereabouts in the budget and forward estimates. So as you can see, it's a fairly significant increase on the saving. But the previous measure had a much larger, longer-term impact. And over the longer term, last year's measure had a bigger contribution to savings. This, I think, represents a consensus, a compromise on where we were before. I mean, if you're not going to change the rate at which all pensions go up, then you need to look at eligibility, and it was ACOS some while ago who put this forward, I think, quite constructively into the debate. It was something the government was already considering, and I think a sort of a common sense consensus has built around this notion of fairer access for a more sustainable pension.
Given that retirees, though, would hopefully be living for decades in their retirement, is $800,000 really enough to get them through?
Well, the pension is a safety net. It's not a superannuation scheme. The pension is there for those whose assets have fallen to a level where they would require that level of support. The pension is not there to provide an incentive. It is there to help people who are most in need in our community. The average assets held by pensioners is around $113,000. So $820,000 is well in excess of what the average pensioner has available to them. And even those with superannuation, the average held amongst pensioners is around $200,000. So we are talking about a cut-off point which is more than four times what even those with superannuation on the pension are able to achieve. Now, I think this is a fair compromise. We are not stepping back from an acknowledging how this will impact in some cases, but that's why I make the point about superannuation. Superannuation scheme is where you use the tax system to encourage people to be self-supporting, and that's why on that scheme the government and I am just appalled at what Chris Bowen has put forward in terms of taxing the income of those who have provided for that income directly and paid tax for it on the way in. Labor aren't seeking to have a sustainable superannuation scheme. What they're seeking to do is broaden the tax base to pay for more welfare, and that's not what this government's doing.
Why shouldn't someone who's got a house, say, worth $2 million, why shouldn't that be included in the assets test?
Well, what you're proposing is that the family home should be in the assets test. Not only are there great difficulties technically in being able to implement such a policy, but equally the family home provides stability for millions upon millions of Australians, and it has been something that gives them a sense of surety and security in their older age. And where people want to downsize and move into smaller homes, I've always thought that is a sensible idea. It particularly assists for those as they get older to move into more age-appropriate accommodation. The Commonwealth currently spends large sums of money refitting people's homes so they can age in place, and more people are staying in their home rather than going into residential aged care accommodation. But no, I think the family home in the assets test is one that violates that principal position of fairness, I think, to most Australian families, and it's not something this government's going to touch.
But is it fair that someone who's got a home worth $2 million compared to someone who's got a home that might be worth $500,000?
What I find interesting about this debate is we often leap to the extremes to justify a change for the majority, and that's why I don't tend to buy into that argument.
Did you watch Struggle Street last night?
Let's stay on the pension for a second, and if you want to ask questions about what television programs I watch, we can do that later.
So if you've got a home worth, $100,000, but as long as you have that if you fall within that threshold, you don't get anything, but the person with the $2 million house who doesn't have as much.
The family home is not included in the assets test, but any assets you have in addition to the family home are. And what we're doing today is we're raising up the threshold, so more people on lower assets, of modest assets, will be able to get a better pension, some $30 per fortnight on average per week. And for those who are on the higher levels of assets, for couples over $820,000, for example, then we're bringing it to that level. And we believe that is a fair and more sustainable way to have the pension on the right track. The pension is currently $42 billion a year. It's rising to $70 billion in the next 10 years.
So if you were renting, for instance, versus someone who was in a $4 million home,
For those who don't own their own home, there is a $200,000 addition to the thresholds. So we're making sure, and we're expanding that gap by over a third, because we recognise that those who don't own their own home have higher living costs, and that's reflected in what we've done here with these changes.
Mr. Just coming out to the question of a review of some sort into retirement income policy generally, leaving aside whether or not the Greens are making this a condition, do you see attractions in this? Does the government see attractions in such a review, since all of these matters that we've been talking about today, superannuation, pension, etc., tax, are all interrelated?
What's important, I think, particularly in this area, is there is some stability and there's some certainty. I think that's important for superannuation, and I think it's important for people to have a good idea about what any changes are down the track. Now, the changes I've announced today don't come into effect until January of 2017. So that gives quite a lead time for people to make preparations for that time. It is important that people, I think, also get a clear message from the government today that this is the only change to the pension that we're putting forward, the only change to the pension, by constraining the eligibility and then getting on to a far more sustainable track. In relation to the other reviews that are out there, we already have a white paper on taxation and a series of other reviews that are underway. We don't want to create any unnecessary anxiety or uncertainty on the part of pensioners or superannuants. That's why I and the Prime Minister and the Treasurer and others, I think, have been sending a very clear and consistent message to those who are saving for their retirement that we don't think that Labor's tax sledgehammer on your retirement income earnings is the right thing to do. And I note that they go beyond that just on superannuation. The Treasurer has also floated, the Shadow Treasurer, the former Treasurer, Chris Bowen, has floated stripping away the negative gearing incentives, which we know ordinary Australians all around the country are using also to provide for their retirement, particularly in places like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and others, and they want to strip that away. The people who are saving for their retirement to be fully self-funded retirees, they're not the problem, they're the solution, and Labor wants to tax them.
The negative gearing affects housing affordability for many people trying to get into the market as well.
Well, I actually don't accept that argument. I think there's a very different analysis of that which leads you to a very different conclusion.
But it is one argument.
Well, there are lots of arguments, that doesn't mean they're right.
you've put together a jobs package for this budget. Is that going to replace the under-30s quarantine welfare?
We'll have more to say on those matters in the budget. Okay.
Watch Struggle Street last night?
I did. My wife and I, we watched it last night, and look, with these sorts of programs, there are the great risks of stereotyping parts of the community. I'm from the Shire, and Channel 10 had a crack at us a number of years ago, which we didn't particularly welcome, and the fact that most of them actually were on the program didn't live in the Shire, I think just sort of showed the credibility of those sorts of things. I mean, we all come from different parts of the country. Australia is the best country in the world to live, whichever part of it you live in, whether it's in Mount Druitt or the Shire or Kununurra or anywhere else. And so I think it's unfortunate that parts of Australia can be stereotyped in those ways. That said, I thought there were some very real issues that were canvassed in that program, the sorts of issues as the Minister for Social Services we deal with every day. And it just highlights why you need to do things which helps people get out of a cycle of welfare and get into the cycle of work. And that's what this budget is going to be about, whether it's for families, whether it's for young people, whether it's people as they grow older. We want to encourage everyone in this country to unlock their potential and to be able to be as self-supporting as they possibly can. We don't want to write people off, and we don't want to see them written off. It grieves me as an Australian to see people in those situations, and we have to turn it around.
Minister, would you support a move in New South Wales to introduce the healthy welfare cards in outback Aboriginal communities?
At present, with the healthy welfare card, we're considering a number of sites for trials, and that's where the proposal rests at this present moment. There are no plans at this point to take the healthy welfare card beyond a trial application. And those trial sites will be identified on the basis of intensive community consultation, which Parliamentary Secretary Alan Tudge has been engaged in now for some months. They've been in a number of locations. No final decisions have been taken on where those sites will be, but we have been very encouraged by I think the very practical and positive response we've had from a number of those sites.
Minister, are you gratified by the commentary that's been around in recent days that you're solving the problems, that you're Mr. Fix-It and presenting the arguments well, and that this will set you up well for a leadership bid one day?
I dismiss all that. Other than to say, we've already got a fixer in the federal parliament. He's my good friend Christopher Pyne.
Can I just check very quickly, is the pension age still being hiked up to 70?
There are no changes to those arrangements, and those measures are still outstanding from previous year's budget. And it's an interesting question, because recently we had the Leader of the Opposition tell us about what was important in this budget and the need to address the budget challenges. Well, in my own portfolio, the Labor Party still opposes some $12 billion worth of savings. They even oppose some savings that the Labor Party themselves introduced when they were in government. This is Bill Shorten's Festival of Ideas, the year of the idea. He's come up with two, and they're both taxes. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about Chris Bowen and Bill Shorten. They think the answer is more taxes and to pay for broadening welfare. We think the answer is welfare based on need, not entitlement, and tax system that gives people incentive to provide for their own future and for their own families. Thank you.